Right, so there's been no more loyal a servant to Israel over these last 10 months, surely, than Genocide Joe Biden himself, possibly with the exception of his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. Thank God Biden's stepping down, though it remains to be seen if Kamala Harris is in any functional sense going to be any better. However, she might turn out, should she win the presidency in November, though. Biden appears to have cemented his unquestioning intentions towards Israel, his immovable support for them, no matter what atrocities they commit, it seems. And if you thought $3.5 billion worth in military aid to Gaza now was bad enough, all things considered, a further $20 billion in aid to Israel has just been approved. This, however, isn't going there all in one lump sum. This is going to head Israel's way from the US over the course of the next several years. What kind of message is that going to be sending to Israel now when the world is desperately suing for peace in the Middle East? And should Israel be found demonstrably guilty of the crime of genocide at the ICJ in due course, a verdict already seen as credible, a case that may itself likely take several years to complete as a result as well, where will that leave the US in which case? If during all of that time they carry on arming Israel, and how much more widespread will the violence become as a result? Right, so as many people consider the ongoing violence and atrocities being committed by Israel in the Middle East right now to be potentially leading to World War III, it now being on a war footing not only in Gaza, but Lebanon and Yemen and Syria and Iran and Iraq. How many more nations are getting added into the mix as they widen their atrocities in a bid by Netanyahu to basically just keep himself in power? Just fundamentally what it all comes down to, surely. He cannot allow a ceasefire, a peace process to happen, because it will collapse his coalition with the far right and his government with it. Things have got so bad for Israel economically and socially as a result, with attacks from Hamas and Hezbollah again in the last few days on northern Israel, on Tel Aviv itself again, the Israeli capital becoming more and more of a target, which can only inevitably lead to more civilian casualties. Not to mention the casualty rate in Gaza, where 21 schools have now been targeted this month by Israel, seemingly for little more reason than they know they're full of refugees and are evidently amongst the last buildings still standing. Israel is going broke on one hand. The cost of the war is crushing the nation's economy. Nobody wants to visit for obvious reasons. The tourism is gone. Foreign investment is down 60% because who wants to invest in a country in the state Israel's in right now? It's hardly a safe bet. Israeli people have even been moving their own money out of Israel, their pension pots, their insurance funds, their savings, so they don't lose them as their own nation essentially loses its shirt. Then there's the boycott, divestment and sanctions actions being taken from around the world, from Colombia pulling the plug on its coal exports to Israel, which relies on coal for its power stations, to Intel pulling out of a $25 billion investment plan just last month. All of that has resulted in 2 credit ratings agencies in the US having downgraded Israel's credit rating in the last few months, and now a 3rd credit reference agency has just done so, as Fitch reduced Israel's credit rating from A+ to A with a negative outlook. The war in Gaza cited by them as the main driver of that. But in a classic example of how tenured Netanyahu is to all of this, though, the official account of the Prime Minister of Israel on Twitter tweeted out yesterday that the Prime Minister's office. The Israeli economy is strong and is functioning well. The lowering of the rating is a result of Israel having to cope with a multi-front war that was forced on it. The rating will be raised again when we win, and we will win. Nobody forced this war on you, you balloon. You started it. The response you have made to the events of October 7th and the Hamas incursion has now become so farcically disproportionate, no sane person can possibly regard it as a situation you were forced into. One night versus 10 months of genocide on your part in response. This professional victim shtick has long since worn out people's patience. At any rate, one person whose patience has clearly not been exhausted with Israel is the can't-go-far-enough President of the United States, Genocide Joe Biden, who, as if handing Israel $3.5 billion in military aid out of US public money isn't enough to keep this war Israel are blatantly driving going, the country's economy so bad the US are just now handing them cash to buy weapons off of them with. Biden is now ensuring they'll be able to carry on doing just that for years to come once he finally leaves office, with a further $20 billion in military aid now having passed Congress. This act could go down as one of the biggest war crimes of the entire current Middle East crisis if Israel eventually gets ruled against in the case brought against them to the International Court of Justice by South Africa, who have now been joined in their legal action by a litany of other nations from around the world. At a time when the emphasis is once again on peace talks, when Israel is financially finding it more and more difficult to keep going in its attacks on Gaza and elsewhere, when these arms will knowingly be used against people in Gaza as much as the excuse will be that they will be there to help protect Israel from Iran and its proxies, the US acts to completely undermine those efforts, taking all pressure off Israel, enabling Netanyahu to carry on scuppering peace talks and sending rockets across a number of borders at this point, and has ensured that for years going forwards, the details and time frame for these new deliveries being detailed in this excerpt from the Associated Press. Congress was notified of the impending sale, which includes more than 50 F-15 fighter jets, advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles, or AMRAAMs, 120mm tank ammunition and high-explosive mortars, and tactical vehicles, and comes at a time of intense concern that Israel may become involved in a wider Middle East war. However, the weapons are not expected to get to Israel anytime soon. They are contracts that will take years to fulfill. Much of what is being sold is to help Israel increase its military capability in the long term. The earliest systems being delivered under the contract aren't expected until the 2026 timeframe. The United States is committed to the security of Israel, and it is vital to US national interests to assist Israel to develop and maintain a strong and ready self-defense capability. This proposed sale is consistent with those objectives, the State Department said in a release on the sale. Such is the clear message of why Biden and the US are doing this. Peace is not their priority and never has been. Stopping Israel's genocide is not their priority either. The overarching priority for the US, in spite of everything Israel is doing and driving as much as they are trying to pin the blame on others, the emphasis on Hamas or Iran, the priority for Biden and the US is the security of Israel because it is vital to US interests. No amount of death and destruction is too much for the US, it would seem, to ensure that their interests in the Middle East are protected. That is, at the end of the day, is what all of their actions will come down to. And given their recent boycott of the Nagasaki atomic bomb commemorations because Israel were disinvited, a bomb the US dropped, lest we forget, clearly they've learnt nothing in decades. Clearly remembrance and peace play second fiddle to US interests, and so often those interests seem to coincide with US involvement in warfare in other countries. It is little wonder the US are considered by many in this era of enlightenment, shall we call it, thanks to the revelations of social media and our ability to choose where we get our news from and become our own media in some cases, to be the biggest threat to world peace going. And just to nail that point down, this $20 billion arms sale got approved the day after the US reaffirmed its commitment to international law on the 75th anniversary of the adoption of the Geneva Conventions. What a sick joke. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, the guy who drove this arms package, nothing ever shaking his resolve to back Israel, put the cherry on top of all of this in his tweet regarding that Geneva Conventions anniversary. Today, we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions of 1949. The United States reaffirms our steadfast commitment to respecting international humanitarian law and mitigating suffering in armed conflict. We call on others to do the same. How about you start? I have no words to describe my feelings towards that man. There just isn't a strong enough invective for him. Deep breaths, Damo. The other point worth highlighting here is the US justification in these arms sales by saying they are needed because of concerns that Israel may soon become involved in a wider war. They are the ones driving that, in case they'd forgotten, enabled by arms you are the main supplier of, incidentally, and you're handing them enough gear to keep them going for years to come. Is it really in US interest to completely destabilise the Middle East? Because if so, a day in The Hague can't come soon enough for all concerned behind this warmongering stupidity. Israeli hard-right politics is driving a wider war, bigger conflict, and the US is just handing them all the tools, all the weaponry to fight it with, whilst claiming to want peace and standing up for international law. I can only speculate what $20 billion could do for people in the United States. Fundamentally, there's always war for war abroad, isn't there, folks? But never any money for ordinary people to make their lives better. It's like our government here in the UK. They're not much different these days. Basically cut from the same cloth, can find $3 billion a year for Ukraine for as long as it takes, but can't lift kids out of poverty with Keir Starmer suspending MPs who voted for the kids and not his ongoing cruelty and messed up priorities. If we're going to see World War III erupt from this ongoing Middle East crisis, the US in no small part are driving us towards it. There will be no ceasefire without the right pressure applied to Israel, and it simply isn't coming. If Israel do widen this war, like Netanyahu himself said, it'll be America's war too. And that is probably the most honest thing he's ever said, but for all the worst of reasons. Meanwhile, Israel, in the space of 48 hours, recently launched attacks on both Lebanon and Iran, because of course they're the victims of this widening war. Get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here. I hope to catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.